Hello, Duke fans. Happy Friday. Welcome in to the Duke Blue Devils Insider Podcast, your daily podcast for all things Duke Blue Devils news. Just like every day, we thank you today so much for joining in to our show and getting your latest every single day on Duke Blue Devils athletics. Today, as we do every Friday morning, we give you the latest scoop on Duke Blue Devils recruiting with on SI recruiting insider Max Dorsey. My name is Hugh Strain, your daily host, as well as Duke beat writer at Duke Blue Devils on SI, giving you the latest here today on everything going on with Duke recruiting post Darian Mensah and Cooper Barkate departing from the program. So without further ado, we'll bring on SI recruiting insider Max Dorsey. Max, we appreciate you being on the show every week. Glad to have you on.
Yeah, happy to be here, Hugh.
So last week we talked about the absolute mayhem that this program went through in terms of losing its quarterback, Darian Mensah, and losing its star wide receiver, Cooper Barkate. The 2006 team is oozing with questions. Who the heck knows where this is going? But we're going to start looking at the future because I think for a lot of Duke fans, that's going to be the most promising part. So both in the class of 27 and 28, Duke has kind of gotten their feet wet in that recruiting cycle with those respective recruiting classes. So we'll start with the class of 2027. Max, what has Duke football been up to in terms of offers and visits with the offensive side of the ball in the recruiting class of 2027?
Yeah, with the 2027 class, it's really been the priority for Duke since the transfer portal ended. Diaz and his staff have both been out on the road recruiting, so a lot of coaches are going to visit some of their top targets in the class, as well as they've hosted a couple of prospects on campus for junior days and whatnot. So they're really offering, hundreds of players right now, trying to build out their board for the 2027 cycle. Obviously, some of the top players atop the 2027 class have already started narrowing down their list, but the vast majority of prospects recruitments are wide open. So Duke's really just in the early stages with a lot of these prospects, especially on the offensive side of the ball. But in terms of prospects that they've made significant progress with, there is one quarterback that Duke fans should start looking out for. It's a Texas native, Bryce McCurdy. He lives in the Waco area, and he actually named Duke as one of his final 6 schools yesterday. So this is a guy who's a 3-star prospect. He's a top 600 overall player in the country. I believe he's the 36th overall quarterback, according to Rivals in the class. Talented player. He named Duke in his top 5 alongside UCF, Cincinnati, Baylor, and Arizona. So, top 6. And so it's going to be tough for Duke to pull him out of Texas. Obviously, being from the Waco area, Baylor's really the favorite there. TCU's made some pretty big strides in his recruitment as well. But Duke is firmly in the mix. They just offered him in September. So, they're still building out that relationship with him. He doesn't have a commitment date at this point in time, but in terms of players that Duke fans should really be, honing their focus in on right now, I would say McCurdy on the offensive side of the ball is the number one guy in that 2027 cycle.
And McCurdy, just as a prospect in general, as a guy you just mentioned, Duke is heavily invested in and looking to get into Durham. Is this a guy that could potentially start year one as a true freshman, or is a guy that Duke would like to develop over time and kind of a project sort of development pick?
I think it's definitely a development type of player. I don't think he would start as a true freshman, and that's not a knock on him. There's just, so few quarterbacks that are able to do that. And I think what we've seen over the past few years in college football is this trend of less and less true freshman quarterbacks seeing the field and more teams opting to bring in transfers as, 1-year bridge quarterbacks as a Band-Aid for their quarterback situation. You see that a lot. So I think that's going to be the route that probably Duke has to go next year regardless, just because of all the fallout of the Mensah situation. Obviously, they brought in a couple of guys this offseason in Ari Patu and Walker Egett, but those guys are really just 1-year Band-Aids. So next year, they have some younger guys on the roster that they might end up turning to. But there's a very real possibility that they kind of fall into this transfer portal purgatory for a little while the younger quarterbacks that they do have rostered start to develop.
And we know Manny Diaz is a defensive-minded coach, and Duke was, I think you could say, fairly disappointing on the defensive side of the ball relative to 2024 when it boasted one of the best defenses in the entire ACC. What is Manny Diaz and his staff doing on the defensive side of the ball in the 2027 recruiting class, trying to bring in some new talent?
Yeah, it's kind of more of the same. You have a lot of prospects being offered right now by Duke. A few prospects have obviously been to Durham on campus and are starting to really strengthen their relationships with the Duke staff. If there was a kind of a Bryce McCurdy mirror prospect on the defensive side of the ball, it would be Montre Jackson, another Texas prospect, interestingly enough. He's a 4-star cornerback, one of the top overall defensive backs in the entire class. And he also named Duke as a finalist in his recruitment. He's down to his top 8 schools, and Duke made that list alongside Oklahoma, Ole Miss, Tennessee, Texas, Texas Tech, Texas A&M, and SMU. So similar to McCurdy here, there's a lot of Texas schools, and you're going to see that with Texas prospects as they tend to want to stay closer to home, as do most prospects. So in order to pull him out of his home state, that's going to be a challenge for Diaz and company. But we've seen, like you said, what Diaz has been able to do with talented defensive backs. It completely changes the defense. So I think Jackson is a player on probably near, the top of Duke's priority list. And he's a guy that the Blue Devils, I expect them to make a big push forward down the line here.
Yeah, well, Duke's got that evidence on paper with the secondary success it's had with guys like Chandler Rivers. Terry Moore did end up transferring out of the program, but was a fantastic player before he tore his ACL. Caleb Weaver came over from Sam Houston State, was a fantastic player for Duke this past season. Guys like Jaden Francois. And, in basketball, you rarely see coaches getting too heavily invested in recruiting classes 2 years in advance, at least to an extreme level. That's not the case with football. Seen some of your awesome pieces over the past week. Duke has gotten into the 2028 recruiting waters. What can you tell us on the 2028 class?
Yeah, I think Duke, alongside all schools, like you said, this is kind of just like a college football thing, and it really does differ from the basketball world. And I think Duke's kind of the perfect example for this, because when you look at Duke's basketball program, they're so well known among recruits, and they're so, like, every kid growing up playing basketball has Duke as automatically as one of their top schools. So you really won't see Duke offer kids, like the 2026 cycle is going on, and if they're interested in a prospect still right now in the 2026 cycle, they might not even offer him. I don't believe they've extended officially an offer to Bruce Branch yet. I know that that was certainly the case at least a month ago. One of the top prospects in the class in the 2026 cycle, obviously reclassified from the 2027 cycle, and they've really held off on offering. And when it comes to college football, it's the complete opposite. You have to get involved on these recruitments early in order to, like I said, build those relationships with not only them, but with their family, start talking to their coaching staff, get them on campus for visits. I feel like official visits in college basketball are much they're still very impactful, don't get me wrong, but there's a lesser emphasis on them as there is in football. So you want these guys on campus as often as possible in terms of football. That's why they host these junior days. That's why they host all these prospects on campus and go and visit these prospects at their home or at their high school. So Duke's really put a priority on targeting some of the top 2028 prospects in the country. 3 that I wanted to point out here. One is King Pitts. He's a 4-star edge rusher from Hawaii. One of the top, I think, 80 overall prospects in the class. I actually did an interview with him after Duke offered him, and he kind of told me, it's still very early in this process, obviously, but he was telling me that what stands out about Duke is the academic prowess as well as the culture that Diaz is building. And you hear a lot of football prospects talk about that when it comes to Duke. A lot of these guys, and you wouldn't necessarily think that, when you're a student athlete, a lot of the time that student portion you think comes secondary, but a lot of these kids are highly interested in the academics that Duke brings to the table. A Duke degree goes a long way in the real world once their athletic careers are over. So when I talk to these prospects about Duke, that's certainly something that comes up a lot. And King Pitts had that to say about the Blue Devils. Another one is a Tennessee edge rusher, again, a 4-star prospect, Braxton Rain, another really talented prospect. I think he's a top 150 overall player in the class, might be top 100, forget off the top of my head, but another super talented guy. He's a player that can play both ways. He's a terrific tight end. I believe he had over 500 yards as a sophomore. And he's another talented player that they've been targeting. And then on the offensive side of the ball, Dendrick Kimbrough, a 4-star wide receiver from Alabama. They recently offered, this is one of the top wide receivers in the country, has interest from over 40 schools, is being heavily pursued by numerous schools. But again, Duke is really just getting their foot in the door of these recruitments. I think that's what's important to note here is that, yeah, they might not get all 3 of those 4 stars in the 2028 class, but they're starting to build that relationship. They're getting the foot in the door. They're establishing themselves as contenders for these guys. And I think that's going to really help them down the line. Once, the 2028 cycle heats up, once the contact period starts, once you can get these guys on official visits, if you've already established that relationship with them, Hugh, it makes it so much easier to then make their final or their top 10 or their top 6 and get them on campus later in their process. So I think that's what Diaz is really prioritizing in the 2028 cycle right now, is getting or building these relationships with these guys early in their process so that when they're thinking about their top schools later down the line, Duke is at the forefront.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point to bring up, how the academics matters, because in football, obviously, you have to be 3 years removed from high school before you even consider entering the draft. Basketball, you just have to be one. So the academics could make a big difference, because if you're a top basketball prospect, odds you're spending 4 years at Duke and getting your degree, pretty low. At Duke could be a lot higher. And you mentioned how, Duke basketball and kind of the contrast with the football programs, how Duke could have a guy on campus be interested and never even extended an offer. That actually just happened with a rising 2026 recruit, Trevor Manhertz. He was a 2026 recruit, reclass of 2027, potentially could reclass back to 2026. Duke had him on an official visit. There was a lot of buzz that John Shire and his staff could have some interest in him, and they had him on an official visit and never actually extended him an offer. Manhertz announced that he was considering Louisville, Indiana, and Duke, but Duke actually never extended an offer. Manhertz ultimately committed to Indiana, but never held an offer from Duke. Now, we'll say on the basketball side of things, as we'll talk about one of Duke's 5-star recruits who got snubbed from the McDonald's All-American game in pretty shocking fashion. So Duke has 3 5-star recruits in its cycle right now for the 2026 class. This would be John Shire & Co.'s 3rd straight year, cementing the number 1 overall recruiting class. That includes 5-star forward Cameron Williams, the number 2 overall prospect, according to the 24/7 Sports composite rankings. That includes Deron Rippey Jr., the number 1 overall point guard, according to 247, and Bryson Howard, the number 12 overall prospect. The first 2 names I just mentioned were selected for the McDonald's All-American game, but Bryson Howard was not. Totally snubbed from that game. A lot of recruits that made it over him. Doesn't really make much sense. Seems like a confusing snub.
Yeah, absolutely. And he's one of 5 players inside 24/7 Sports' top 25 overall prospects that didn't make it. So snubs happen every year, but like you said, Howard, number 12 overall, or at least the 24/7 Sports, the number 12 overall prospect in the class. It really doesn't make a lot of sense. He's uber talented and one of the best players in the country. Obviously, super happy that Rippey and Williams made it. But yeah, I think when it comes to all-star games like this, no one's ever going to be happy. It's all objective. So subjective. So you're not really getting it's just from a bunch of other people's opinions. So obviously, while me and you might think Howard's more than deserving, he doesn't make it. That's just sometimes the way things unfold. So obviously it hurts, but I think it's going to put a chip on his shoulder heading into the 2026-2027 basketball season once he gets on campus in Durham. And I think that's something Duke fans should be excited about, because I think he's going to go out and prove that he is one of the top players in the country.
Howard was the first commit of this recruiting class. Some of the lower prospects that made it over him, the McDonald's All-American game, were number 74 overall prospect Darius Bivens, who is uncommitted but heavily predicted to end up at Texas Tech, and number 31 overall prospect Quinn Costello, who is committed to Michigan. Now, in the grand scheme of things, really doesn't mean all that much that Bryson Howard wasn't selected. And if Duke fans want to see their last 5-star recruit who was not selected to this game, they don't even have to look back that far. It was Con Knippel, who was snubbed from the McDonald's All-American game his senior year. He went on to win ACC tournament MVP, went to the Final Four with Duke, and ended up being the number 4 overall pick in the 2025 NBA draft, and is currently putting together one of the best rookie seasons in the history of the NBA with the Charlotte Hornets. So, Max, at the end of the day, really doesn't mean that much, and I think Duke fans can be, pretty excited about what Bryson Howard is going to bring to Durham.
Yeah, it doesn't mean that much. And another name that I found when looking at past snubs is Kyle Filipowski. So Duke has had this happen before. Obviously, some of their top commits have not made this game. And it is, you could argue it's the number 1 showcase in the country. And so to not make the team, it is disrespected, or not make the roster, it is disrespect, or you could see it as disrespectful. So I think, like I said, Howard's going to have a chip on his shoulder, obviously a super talented player. And this is something that I think will propel his career forward rather than hold him back.
Yeah. You think the McDonald's All-American game is about having the best talent in the country compete against each other, but you don't have the 12th best player in the entire class. What are you going to do? Doesn't make that much sense, but doesn't really make that big of a difference. Hopefully Howard brings that to the court for the Blue Devils next season. That is going to do it for us today here on the Duke Blue Devils Insider Podcast. Max, we thank you so much, just like every week, providing us and the rest of the Duke fan faithful with all the latest recruiting insight.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me, Hugh.
That's going to do it for us here today at the Duke Blue Devils Insider Podcast. We thank you so much for tuning in today, as well as every single day to get your latest on the Duke Blue Devils news. Make sure to check us out at si.com/college/Duke every single day to get your latest on the Duke Blue Devils. My name is Hugh String, your daily host, as well as Duke beat writer at Duke Blue Devils on SI. We thank you so much for tuning in like always, and I'll see you tomorrow.